Hello everyone, I hope that you've had a good week. This morning we're going to be continuing with our series on Ephesians, but just before we get into Ephesians, I'd like to tell you a story. Now just a bit of background to where we're going to join this story. It's about a young boy called Hamid, who is a street kid in Morocco, and each day he goes to the house of a missionary nurse for a meal and to hear a story about Jesus. Now this one day, one of the boys who was there every single day hadn't turned up, and the nurse was concerned about him. And so Hamid agreed to go with the nurse to show her where this boy was staying so that she could go and find out if he was okay. The nurse went upstairs to get ready to go, and that is where we will join the story. He had never been left alone before, and he found it very interesting. He poked his nose into the room on the left and found himself in a little kitchen. On the table stood a china basin of eggs, just low enough for him to help himself. Hamid hesitated. He could not count, but perhaps the nurse could, and she would notice if he took two. On the other hand, raw eggs sucked through the little hole in the top were delicious, and Hamid had not tasted one for a long time. He thought, on the whole, it was worth the risk. She couldn't exactly prove that he was the culprit. So he took one egg in each hand and waited for the nurse. He didn't wait long. The nurse soon appeared with something Hamid had not bargained for, a powerful torch. "Come along," said the nurse, turning on her torch. "Come and get under my coat and we can both walk in the light." But to the nurse's surprise, Hamid did not wish to walk in the light. He seemed to be taking great care to keep out of the beam, slinking along the gutters, shuffling against the wall. It was very dark and very muddy, and once or twice he slipped a little, clutching his precious eggs tightly in both hands. "Why don't you walk with me in the middle of the road?" asked the nurse, puzzled. "I'm all right," muttered Hamid rather miserably. He was not enjoying himself at all. He was so afraid of that broad beam of light, and the eggs somehow did not seem worth it. He wished he could get rid of them, and yet at the same time he wanted to hold on to them. The light of the torch made the surrounding darkness pitch black. Hamid could not see where he was going at all. Suddenly he caught his foot on an unexpected step and fell violently forward on his face. He gave a sharp cry of shock and pain, and the nurse, who was a little ahead, turned around quickly and switched on the light full onto him. She saw him struggle to his feet, his garment covered with black mud and yellow egg yolk. She saw his hands clasping the smashed shells, and his grazed knees streaming with blood, and she understood at once what had happened. He would have scuttled away from her, but she took hold of him quickly, and he burst into frightened tears. What would she do? She certainly would never have him in her house again. He had given up his right to the only shelter left to him on earth. Never again would he enter that place of warmth and light. He was shut out, and it was all his own fault. Then, through his sobs, he heard the voice of the nurse speaking quietly to him. "Come along," she said. "You've cut your knees badly. We'll go home and bind them up, and then you can show me the way afterwards." She kept a tight hold of him, and they walked home in silence, except for Hamid's sniffs. There was a lull in the rain. They re-entered the quiet, warm house, and the nurse locked the door on the inside. Still silent and ashamed, he washed his hands under the tap, and then the nurse told him to sit down. She fetched a basin of warm water and bathed his knees until the cuts and grazes were quite clean. Then she bound them up with ointment and white bandages, and when she'd finished, she took a good look at him. He sat slumped in a sorry little heap covered with mud and raw eggs. The only clean parts of him were the little tracks on his cheeks where his tears had made furrows through the grime. Still, without speaking, the nurse went upstairs to the bundle of old clothes and came back with new clothes for him. Then she fetched some more warm water and soap and told him to scrub himself clean all over. Next, she gave him his new clothes and sat down beside him once he was dressed. He looked up at her, marvelling, for it was his very first experience of anyone returning good for evil, and he could not understand it. Instead of prison and a beating, he'd been given medicine and clean, beautiful clothes. Hamid, the nurse said to him, you fell over and hurt yourself because you would not walk in the light with me. You were afraid to walk in the light because you had stolen my eggs. There was no answer. You don't deserve to ever come here again, went on the nurse. But they were my eggs and I paid for them. So I am going to forgive you. Only you must promise never to steal anything out of my house again. Hamid nodded. And remember, said the nurse, speaking very slowly and earnestly, you could not walk with me in the light because of your wrongdoing. The Lord Jesus says he's the light of the world. He asks you to walk beside him all the way and every day until you reach his beautiful bright home. But first you must tell him about your wrongdoing and ask him to wash away all its stains and make you clean. Just as I washed away the mud and the egg, then you must leave it behind forever and keep beside him in the light. Hamid looked down at his clean clothes and his spotless bandage and understood. The eggs that had seemed so precious were gone, but he did not want them any more. He'd been forgiven and washed and made clean, and he'd been brought back into the warmth and shelter of the nurse's home. They were going out again in the dark to find the boy's house, but it would be quite different now. He would get under the nurse's big warm coat and walk beside her, sheltered from the rain. He would not stumble, and he would not be afraid of the light any longer, because he no longer had anything to hide. They would walk guided by its bright, steady beam. It would be a treat.